In this video, we're going to look at Project 4, which looks at taking a project we've previously worked on and incorporating a database into the fold. So we're going to use the login module that we completed for Project 2. And what we're going to do is we're basically going to create a database that holds that user data. And instead of having a hard-coded user list, we are going to import the data from the database into the application. So rather than go and recreate the wheel, what we're going to do is go to Project 2, copy our 3 files, and we're going to put them in our Project 4 user database folder rather, and then we're going to open it up. So we'll open main. Yep, we do trust the files. If you get anything about trust, you can absolutely say yes. Screens and our library. So again, I'll just swing the other files over here. So just to quickly recap, I won't spend too long on this. Go back and look at Project 2 for more information. We created 2 screens, our login screen and then our dashboard, just to show success in our login. Some simple interface elements, text inputs, and a button to make it all work. And then in our library, we just simply created our user verification, which relies on the user list. So basically what we want to do is use a database to store this data, and then obviously access it in our login. So in order to do this, we need to create a new text file. And as always, the first thing we do is we save it. And this is going to be our database library. So similar to what we talked about with our user login module, it's something we're going to use multiple times. Obviously, we're going to have multiple projects where we're interacting with a database. So it makes sense to create a library. Within that, we're going to create a database object. I'm going to call it DB for short. All right. And as always, we create our initialization of our database. And for the time being, we will just pass. Actually, we do need to add one attribute now that I think about it. File name. And so basically, this is going to point to the file that we want to use for our database. So self.filename equals a file name. All right, let's save that. So when we're putting together our database, the first thing we need, or whenever we're using a database, I should say, not just putting it together, but whenever we're interacting with a database, the first thing we need to do is to connect to the database. So what we'll do is we're going to create a method. Now I'll put a little bit of space in, why not? Called DB connect, so database connect. All right, and for our projects, we want to basically have the database file within the same folder as the rest of our files. So what we're going to do is we're going to add a variable called folder, which takes advantage of a library that's already created called OS. So os.path, so the path library, the directory name method, dir name, and then done to file means this file. So basically wherever this library is saved, this is where we want to create the database file. All right, the file equals os, the path, the join method. So basically what we're doing here is to create the full file name, we're combining the folder name with the file name of our database. And what we're going to get it to return for us is from the SQLite library within Python, the connect method for the file. All right, so you can see we've imported a couple of libraries. So let's import those, OS and SQLite. Oh, SQLite 3, that's right. So let's save that. So yeah, so just to recap from those, the OS library, short for operating system, we're just basically accessing the file path of the database library file and using that to connect to a file within that database. So the first time we actually run this, it will create the database for us, which is pretty handy. And one of the reasons why we use this method is it will actually create the database for us. So in terms of, running this, we basically want to create the connection to the database when we start up the app. So as part of our application where we've, built our screens, imported our screen manager, all that sort of stuff, we want to add our database. So from our DB file, our DB object, and for this one, we'll just call it users.db. So as I said, we haven't created this yet, but the first time it runs, it will actually create this for us. So then to connect, we want to, for our data object that we've created, run the db connect method. So you can see I've got the little squiggle. I forgot to import the DB, so make sure you do that at the top. I'll save that. Why is it saying it can't find that? Did I save it in the wrong file? Project 4. Don't know, just having a little meltdown maybe. Let's just run it, make sure it doesn't break. So I do have a interface window here. At the moment, not too much has been signaled, but at least we haven't created any issues, which is a good start. Well, actually, what we can do to test, not so much in the interface, but we should now see in our project folder, we've got a file here called users.db. All right, so if you don't necessarily see it here, it may be that you've made a little boo-boo with the folder in the file, and it has created one. It's just done so basically in your main Python directory, which is probably like C/users/username, that sort of thing. Wherever you've saved your Python file, it's probably hiding in there. So I don't know why it's throwing up the warning. It's not an error, but yeah, it is working because we've got a database file there. If I go back. All right, so now what we want to do is create our database table. So obviously we could go into something like a DB browser and just manually do that. But obviously if we're building bigger SQL systems, databases, it does help to have an automated process for that. So what we're going to do is create a new method called create table. And this one needs two parameters, the connection as well as the SQL that we want to run. And basically, whenever we're writing something to the database, there's 3 steps that we need to take. The first one is we create what's called a cursor. So we create an instance of the cursor in our database that we're connected to. So that's the con. We then take that cursor and we use it to execute our SQL. And then we want to actually save the changes to our database. So con.commit will save those changes to our database. All right, so we've got the basic setup for creating our tables. So now what we want to do is run that in our login app. So if we go in and create, no, sorry, I don't want to define it, I want to run it. So for our database object called data, create table. So we're going to pass in the connection and then also pass in the SQL. So create table. I'm going to call it accounts. And then I'm going to say username, which is text type, and password, which is also a text type. All right, so this is just a simple SQL, which will create a table called accounts, and that table will have two fields, one called username, one called password. All right, so we'll save that in the main.py. Make sure we've saved our DB library. All right, so now if we run, all right, we're still getting the window, which means there's no errors. All right, and I should have showed this before. I just realized I didn't have the file size there, but you should now see that your file for users.db has magically increased from 0 to 8. I can probably just quickly demo that again. Not ideal, wasting a bit of time, but cancel. I've got to close that down. So I'll just comment this out so you can see when it's just run without the table. So if I save, that's saved, I think so. Let's run it. So yeah, so you'll see the users.db has 0 kilobytes in it. So the new one we've created, but if I add the table in, so I've rerun it. I just realized the window's popping up over here, but 8 kilobytes. So we've now got a table in there. I should probably quickly open the DB browser to show that. So let's open it up. Why is it having a meltdown? Got a dialog box open. Where are we? 2025. So yeah, you can see now we've got accounts, which has username and password. If you browse the data, you've got a table with 2 fields in it. All right, so we've successfully managed to add a table. Now we've got a table, the next step is to add some data. All right, well, actually, before we do that, I will just quickly address a potential error. So if I rerun this program, it will have a little meltdown and say that you can't execute this SQL because the table accounts already exists. So obviously there's a couple of ways around this. Once we've created the table, you could always just comment it out, but you don't want to have to go in and comment multiple tables out if you're creating them all. So what we can do is in our SQL, we can actually add a keyword if not exists. And basically this will just run it and create the table if it doesn't already exist. So if we run this now, you'll see we do get the thing back, which means that it's all working nicely. So yeah, so if not exists, just add that little keyword in there and you can leave the table in there. But in saying that, you can also comment it out. We only need to create it once. But now we want to create our database data. So we actually want to add some data into our database. If we go and have a look, you can see we've got a couple of users. So we'll just try and add these values in. As always, we want to create the method first so that we can call upon it. So create data. So this time we've got the connection, the SQL that we want to run, but also the values we want to enter, because generally the values will come from things like text boxes, user input. So we have the values separate, and then we pass that into the SQL, which we then pass into the database through the cursor, which we then use to actually write data to our database. All right, but it's the same action again. We create the cursor. So con.cursor, again, you'll notice I'm not copying. As always, I'm typing it out. I'm spending time interacting with the code. So this time when we execute, we also need to pass in the values to know what to actually write into the SQL and then consequently into the database. So we commit. And then a nice little thing we can do is if we return the last row ID, basically this just tells us that we've successfully added the data in. So it can be useful when we're running this to have that functionality. We won't probably use it too much in this application, but again, we're setting this up for future versions. All right, so once we've got that, we can go back into our login app. And you wouldn't normally do it in this part. Obviously, you'd normally have some sort of user registration, which hint, we will have a look at in the near future. But for now, we're just going to insert it at the start. So we've got some data. So insert into accounts. And I guess if we're strictly doing this correct, we should put username and password in. I don't think I did in the written tutorial. Values. So we just use question marks as placeholders for the values. All right, so that's our SQL, is that string that we've put in there. And then our values are going to be in a list. And we'll just add John and ABC, comma, and then ABC as well. All right, so I'll just try and make this a bit wider so we can see the whole line there. All right, so we're going to insert that into our database. So let's save that. Database file saved. So now if we run it, all right, you can see the window pops up, which means it should have worked. If we go to our DB browser, you might not see anything, but if you press the refresh button, you'll then see John and ABC are there. All right, if we run this again, it won't run with any errors. I'll just do it again just to prove that it works. All right, but what you will find is that if you refresh, it's re-added John and ABC in. So obviously if you have a primary key set up for your username, this will throw an error because it'll say John's already inserted into this database. But again, we're not necessarily going to run it at this point of the program normally. And because we're only using it for testing purposes, no one really cares if there's multiple instances. So don't sweat on that. Once we get into seeing how this works and you're implementing it, as I said, through probably the register app that we're going to look at in the near future, then it will become important. But for now, this is fine. In saying that, I will just do that just to save space. We don't want every time we run it to create a new value. Otherwise the database will get quite big quite quickly. If I refresh, it's still 8 kilobytes, so it's not the worst, but yeah, can get out of hand if we leave it to be. So we've now got our tables created. We've got our data in there, so we can actually use. All right, but I guess in order to be able to generate the user list, we need to return the data from the database. So this is reading the data. So in this case, we're going to read data. So again, we have a connection. We have an SQL that we're going to write. All right, it follows the same process. So we connect to the cursor in our database. Oh, hang on. It's like, what's the error? Use the wrong bracket there. There we go. That's better. We execute the SQL. So we are still running the SQL. This time it's just a read. So we don't actually have to commit the changes in this instance because we've already, or we're not actually writing anything. We're not changing anything. We're just accessing the data that's there. But what we do want to do is we do want to return the data. So from the cursor, we want to fetch all of the data. So we save the database. And now we've got that set up, we can run that in our application. So currently our user list, as we said, is hard coded, but we want it to return the data that we've stored in our database. So to do this, we want to access the database, but because it's in the login app, we can't just start by saying data.read data. We do have to add in that it's in the login app. So from the login app object, we want the data, which is the database object. Then we can read the data. And again, we want the connection from the login app, so loginapp.con. And we just want to select all the data from the accounts table. All right, so we'll get all of the users. That will generate our user list. All right, if we want to just have a look at that, we can print our user list. All right, and you'll see that it does return that list of tuples similar to what we had set up. So because we sort of knew that already, the way we've set up our verify user for the user list is to actually look through a list of tuples. So now we've got that, we can successfully, or at least let's hopefully successfully, generate our user list. So I'll just close the previous window and we'll run the program. Doesn't spit an error, which is great to see. So the user list will only print out once I press the login button. So if I press it now, you'll see it generates the user list. So John ABC is our only option. So even if we go back to one of the other ones that worked previously, so Mary and Lamb, nothing, it just reprints the list. All right, but if we go John and ABC, it then successfully logs us in. All right, I guess if we wanted to test that it is actually coming from the database, we should create one that didn't already exist. So let's just go Johnson, ABCD, save. So we'll run this. So I mean, we can just quickly check it is in the database, and we can also now use that combination to log us into the system. So once you got to that stage, you've successfully been able to create a database with the database tables, create data within the database, and then obviously reading the data out of the database and interacting with it in our solution.